Imagine a room with no cameras, no microphones, just silence, tension, and two sides who once stood on opposite ends of war. Behind those closed doors, something unexpected happened. Words replaced weapons, fear turned into understanding, and decisions made in whispers began shaping the future of an entire region. Today, I'm going to take you inside that story, not of power, but of perspective, a story that proves real change doesn't always start with force. It starts with conversation. Stay with me till the end. Because what happened in those secret talks between Pakistan and the Taliban may just change the way you see diplomacy, peace, and leadership forever. After the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021, the entire regional landscape shifted in ways few could have predicted. For Pakistan, this moment marked both an opportunity and a profound challenge. On one side, it shared deep cultural, ethnic, and historical ties with Afghanistan. On the other, it faced the looming risk of instability spilling across its borders. The world's attention was on the public chaos, but in the background, Pakistan's leadership began carefully navigating a new reality that demanded caution, diplomacy, and foresight. The collapse of the previous Afghan government had created a sudden power vacuum. Millions of Afghan refugees sought shelter, trade routes were disrupted, and exploiting the confusion, Pakistan, already managing its own internal security and economic pressures, realized that if it didn't engage with the new rulers of Kabul, the cost could be unbearable for both nations. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, quiet channels of communication began to open. Pakistan's military and diplomatic circles recognized that traditional diplomacy through official state-to-state platforms would not be enough. Instead, the focus turned to back-channel dialogues, private, discreet, and strategic. The aim was not to endorse or oppose the Taliban's rise, but to ensure that Afghanistan's transition did not push the region toward another prolonged conflict. Behind closed doors, the message was consistent. Peace and stability were in the mutual interest of both countries. The global community observed with curiosity but maintained distance. Western nations had withdrawn, leaving a vacuum that regional players like Pakistan had to fill responsibly. The situation required a delicate balance, engaging enough to maintain influence, but not so much that it appeared to the world as political favoritism. This was a tightrope walk, one where every word and every meeting mattered. Pakistan's approach, therefore, became one of cautious pragmatism. It understood that open confrontation or isolation would only deepen mistrust, while quiet coordination could prevent disaster. The background context of these secret discussions reveals how regional diplomacy often works beyond headlines. These interactions were not about politics alone. They were about managing migration, preventing cross-boundary terrorism, stabilizing trade, and preserving hope for millions living along a fragile frontier. It was a moment when silence became strategy, and strategy became the language of survival for two nations bound by history and geography. The secret meetings between Pakistan and the Taliban were not spontaneous. They were the result of months of discreet coordination and mutual necessity. After the Taliban assumed control of Kabul, both sides faced a complicated reality that could not be addressed through public statements alone. For Pakistan, maintaining border security became an urgent concern as the frontier was witnessing an influx of refugees, increased smuggling, and militant movement. For the Taliban, struggling to establish governance and gain legitimacy, stabilizing relations with its most immediate neighbor was equally critical. Behind the scenes, both sides understood that their interests intersected far more than they conflicted. Thus began a series of closed-door discussions held at undisclosed locations, away from media scrutiny and political theater. These meetings reportedly included key figures from Pakistan's military, intelligence services, and foreign office, as well as senior representatives from the Taliban's new government. The atmosphere was cautious, with both parties aware that trust would not come easily. The agenda was practical rather than ideological. Topics range from border management and trade routes to refugee repatriation and countering extremist factions like ISIS, which threatened to destabilize both countries. While neither side sought to publicize the talks, the urgency of preventing cross-border violence made these interactions unavoidable. The objective was simple yet significant: create a framework to manage immediate tensions and lay the groundwork for longer-term stability. Participants reportedly engaged in frank exchanges, sometimes disagreeing sharply, but remaining focused on the need for coexistence. Pakistan pressed for tighter control over militant groups operating near its territory, while the Taliban sought support for humanitarian relief and trade facilitation. The tone of these meetings was shaped by realism rather than rhetoric. Both parties were aware that a total breakdown in communication would only empower extremists and invite external interference from rival powers seeking to exploit regional instability. The secrecy of these discussions allowed for a level of honesty rarely possible in public diplomacy. Without the fear of international judgment, negotiators could speak candidly about their limitations and needs. These talks were less about signing agreements and more about establishing an understanding, a silent acknowledgement that despite political and ideological differences, geography and history tied their fates together. What emerged from these encounters was not a treaty or a headline, but a cautious opening, a fragile bridge between two governments that had more to lose by fighting than by talking. The outcomes of the secret meetings between Pakistan and the Taliban were never officially documented, yet their effects began to surface quietly across the region. While no formal agreements were signed, subtle shifts on the ground reflected the results of these behind-the-scenes discussions. One of the first visible impacts was a noticeable reduction in border clashes that had previously intensified following the Taliban's return to power. Both sides appeared to have reached an understanding to exercise restraint along the Durand Line, where small skirmishes had once risked escalating into larger confrontations. Local sources also reported the reopening of certain trade routes that had been suspended due to political uncertainty, signaling a cautious revival of economic cooperation. The reopening of these crossings was not only an economic move, but a humanitarian one as well, allowing food and medical supplies to flow more easily between the two countries. Another significant outcome was the establishment of informal communication channels designed to manage cross-border issues swiftly. These were not official diplomatic structures, but practical lines of contact that enable quick responses to potential flashpoints. This helped prevent misunderstandings that could have reignited tension. At the same time, both sides explored ways to manage the massive refugee population that had poured into Pakistan, emphasizing voluntary return and support through international aid. The discussions also touched upon security coordination, particularly concerning the growing threat of ISIS-K, a group that targeted both Taliban positions inside Afghanistan and Pakistani security forces near the border. Although these initiatives were fragile and often tested by incidents on the ground, they represented a step toward recognizing mutual responsibility. The Taliban's willingness to engage, even discreetly, suggested an awareness that governance required cooperation beyond ideological boundaries. Pakistan, on the other hand, sought to stabilize its western frontier to focus on its economic challenges and domestic reforms. The success of these talks lay not in grand declarations, but in the gradual reduction of uncertainty. Small shifts, fewer border violations, smoother trade logistics, and improved humanitarian coordination showed that dialogue had made a difference, even if modestly. Despite these positive signs, unresolved issues remained. The Durand Line dispute persisted as a sensitive point of contention, and mistrust lingered over militant movements on both sides of the border. Yet for a region accustomed to confrontation, even a temporary calm marked a quiet but meaningful change born out of conversations that the world never fully witnessed. The international response to the secret talks between Pakistan and the Taliban was cautious, yet closely observant. While the discussions themselves remained unofficial and largely unpublicized, their implications were significant for regional and global diplomacy. Western governments, particularly those that had withdrawn from Afghanistan after 2 decades of involvement, were aware that some form of regional coordination was inevitable. The vacuum left by the exit of NATO forces meant that countries sharing borders with Afghanistan had to assume a greater role in maintaining stability. For Pakistan, that role came with both opportunity and scrutiny. The West recognized Pakistan's strategic importance, but also worried about the risk of renewed extremism if the Taliban's rule remained unchecked. Thus, Islamabad's engagement with the Taliban was seen as a balancing act, necessary but fraught with political and reputational challenges. In international circles, these dialogues were interpreted as a pragmatic step rather than an endorsement. Diplomats in European capitals quietly acknowledged that direct communication between Pakistan and the Taliban could prevent humanitarian crises and security breakdowns, while public statements remained restrained. Private assessments noted that without Pakistan's mediation, the region might have slid into chaos much faster. Humanitarian organizations also viewed these talks with cautious optimism as they opened limited but vital channels for the delivery of aid across the Afghan border. At the same time, major powers like the United States and China monitored the developments from different perspectives. Washington remained skeptical, wary of any arrangement that could empower militant factions or undermine counterterrorism objectives. Beijing, on the other hand, saw an opportunity for regional stability that would protect its investments in infrastructure and trade routes. Both recognized that Pakistan's role was indispensable, yet its position was precarious. Islamabad had to maintain credibility with global partners while simultaneously engaging with a government that much of the international community still hesitated to recognize. For the Taliban, these secret discussions were equally critical. They offered a platform to demonstrate diplomatic maturity and to prove that Afghanistan under their rule could engage constructively with neighboring countries. The ability to conduct such talks without public confrontation helped the Taliban project a sense of control and responsibility even as they faced isolation on the world stage. These international perceptions reinforced an important reality, that regional peace in South Asia would depend not merely on military might or political declarations, but on sustained, careful communication among those who share the same turbulent geography. The quiet exchanges between Pakistan and the Taliban underscored a profound lesson about how peace often takes root, not through grand summits or televised agreements, but in private spaces where dialogue replaces confrontation. These talks reveal that diplomacy's true strength lies in its ability to bring opposing sides together, even when trust is fragile and history is heavy with suspicion. Both parties came to understand that conversation, no matter how limited, was still a bridge. In a region long defined by conflict, that bridge represented a rare moment of realism. The discussions showed that progress can emerge not from idealism, but from shared vulnerability. Neither Pakistan nor the Taliban could afford endless hostility. Both had more to lose than to gain from chaos. The lesson that emerged was simple yet powerful. Silence can sometimes achieve what public rhetoric cannot. Behind closed doors, the absence of cameras allowed sincerity to surface. Participants could speak honestly about their fears, their limitations, and their hopes without the pressure of public judgment. This environment made it possible to see the human side of conflict, the recognition that both sides were grappling with instability, economic hardship, and international isolation. In such a setting, diplomacy became less about image and more about survival. The talks reminded observers that sustainable peace rarely begins with signatures. It begins with understanding. These meetings also highlighted the importance of patience in diplomacy. No major breakthrough occurred overnight, and misunderstandings continued to arise. Yet the persistence to keep communicating itself became a symbol of progress. Every discussion that avoided confrontation, every pause that replaced an attack, contributed to a subtle but meaningful shift in tone. It was not about immediate results, but about planting the seeds of coexistence in soil hardened by decades of distrust. For the broader international community, this experience carried a universal message that peace is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of communication. Even the most complex disputes can be softened when dialogue takes precedence over domination. The Pakistan-Taliban interactions reminded the world that diplomacy must sometimes unfold away from the noise to truly work. By choosing conversation over conflict, both sides demonstrated that hope can survive even in the most unlikely corners of history, proving that the first step towards stability is not victory, but the courage to listen. In the end, the story of these secret talks between Pakistan and the Taliban reminds us that history is not always written in loud moments. Sometimes it is shaped in silence. What happened behind those closed doors was more than a political event. It was a human realization that dialogue, no matter how uncertain, is better than division. These meetings did not erase decades of mistrust, but they proved that even in the most fragile circumstances, the willingness to communicate can prevent chaos and open the path towards stability. For a region long trapped between conflict and hope, this quiet diplomacy became a symbol that peace is not impossible, it is just unfinished work that needs courage, patience, and empathy. As we reflect on this story, may we remember that true strength lies not in dominance, but in understanding. Nations like people grow when they choose to talk instead of fight. The lesson of these secret talks is not about secrecy itself, but about the bravery it takes to pursue peace when it's easier to walk away. Let this be an inspiration that no matter how divided our world becomes, communication remains humanity's last and greatest bridge. Thank you all for listening with open minds and open hearts. May your own path be guided by wisdom, peace, and purpose. Good luck to everyone striving to build understanding in their own corners of the world, because change, real change, always begins with a conversation.